The Aztecs by Nigel Davies. Chapter 6. The Lion of Anahuac. On the fourth day after Tloc's death, in 1486, the Mexican leaders assembled to elect their new master. The occasion was a grave one. After the early demise of the last ruler and the setbacks of recent years, the Aztec polity was unsettled, and subject peoples restive. Another mistaken choice could have brought irreparable disaster upon the empire. The obvious candidate was the younger brother of the two last rulers, following the tendency for the throne to pass from one brother to another rather than from father to son. Some counselors initially opposed such a step. They did not wish for this, because the greatness of Mexico required someone old and venerable, whom the nations would hold in awe, and whom they themselves would respect. These objections fortunately carried little weight, and Ocelot, younger brother of Tloc, was duly chosen. He was still young at the time, but was soon to prove his mettle. The summons immediately went forth to celebrate the election, and the news spread to all corners of the empire that the sun, once dimmed, had come to shine anew. And in truth, during his reign, the Aztec sun was to shine with a brilliance never surpassed, like a star whose light is intensified in spectacular fashion before it is suddenly and forever dimmed. The electors, in making the most natural choice, had selected a giant among men. Tenochtitlan, and indeed the whole empire, now possessed a monarch of a heroic stamp, who was to impose his will upon peoples living in remote lands, where only traders had so far penetrated, returning with fabulous tales. The two great Aztec conquerors differed greatly. Moctezuma I, an older man, even at his accession, had not led his greatest campaign in person. He was, however, a great administrator and organizer. Ocelot, on the other hand, inseparable from his armies, however remote the battle, gained distinction as a field commander of genius. If Moctezuma could be likened to a Julius Caesar, Ocelot was by comparison an Alexander. Like some of his predecessors, he was already one of the two army commanders when elected to the throne. He was a man whose character went to extremes. He was munificent to his friends and pitiless to his foes. His powers of leadership were outstanding, and he always shared the hardships of his soldiers, spurring them by his example to superhuman feats. At times, however, he could not be merely cruel but ferocious. Not only did he increase the tempo of human sacrifice until it became a holocaust. In his dealings with subject rulers, he could be peremptory, if not ruthless. It fell to Nezahualcóyotl of Texcoco to address the new Tlatoani on his election, telling him that, jointly with Huitzilopochtli, he would bear the burden of providing sustenance for his people. Nezahualcóyotl was at his best on such occasions, though, as will be seen, such ceremonies of state were more to his taste than the arduous campaigns of Ocelot, in which he was expected to participate. The prescribed ritual was then followed, constituting the ruler's initiation, as opposed to his coronation, which took place later. This included the piercing of the nostrils and the insertion of the special stone plug, the donning of the royal finery, and the formal homage to Huitzilopochtli. Many Thames of the royal regalia were turquoise in color, including a mantle made of a kind of netting and studded with jewels. This was the color of the god himself, as lord of the southern sky. Among these, the many who came to pay their respects were the merchants. These, as previously explained, had attained a special position and prestige in society. Ocelot was not slow to conform to custom, and to initiate his first campaign, in order to obtain sacrificial victims for his formal coronation. This ruler, the future conqueror of a vast stretch of the Pacific littoral, and of lands bordering on the distant Guatemala, chose a more limited objective for his initial operations, the rather arid region to the northwest of his capital, already once conquered. As frequently occurred, a new ruler had to reimpose his yoke on places previously subdued. He first overcame the resistance of Chiquipilco and of other towns of this neighborhood. After such successes, the army, perhaps grown unaccustomed to dynamic leadership, showed signs of battle fatigue. Ocelot, however, forbade any soldier to abandon the expedition on pain of death. He then proceeded to the conquest of the city of Chiapa, not to be confused with Chiapas, on the Guatemalan border, later to be subdued. A direct attack was made by the contingents of several subject peoples, while the Mexica themselves followed a path disclosed by local defectors, taking the city by surprise and storming the temple, which invariably served as a strong point in war, apart from its religious significance. The Spaniards were later to take frequent advantage of the protection offered by high pyramids. The victors slaughtered all the priests and burnt their dwelling places. The enemy forces capitulated, many were made prisoner, and the city was sacked as the normal reward for the soldiers. The attack on the next place on the line of march Xilotepec became a rout. The troops were so sure of victory and so eager for spoils that they broke ranks, rushing forward like a horde of locusts devouring a field. The enemy soon lost heart, and the huge army poured into the defenseless city. The citizens besought Ocelot to hold back his soldiers. He sent his captains to stop the pillage, but they had to drag their troops from the houses by force, loaded with booty. Padre Duran wryly remarks that the scene recalled the sack of Rome, or the destruction sometimes wrought by the Spaniards themselves. The triumphant army returned to the capital, and, following the usual interminable speeches of welcome, the rulers of subject provinces went back to their own lands. The day was now fixed for the Tlatoani's formal coronation. As on all such occasions, efforts to attract the neighboring peoples to the ceremony knew no bounds. The intention of these Mexicans in preparing a festival was to make known their king, and to ensure that their enemies, those of Tlaxcala, Huechotzingo, Cholula, and the other cities of that province, as well as those of Michoacan and of Mestitlan, should be conscious of the greatness of Mexico and should be terrorized and filled with fear, and that they should know, by the prodigality and wealth of jewels and other presents given away at the ceremonies, how great was all the abundance of Mexico, its valor and its excellence. Finally, all was based on ostentation and vainglory, with the object of being feared as the owners of all the riches of the earth and of its finest provinces. To this end, they ordered these feasts and ceremonies so splendidly. This quotation casts a lurid light on an obsession lying at the very root of the Aztec will to conquer. Not merely the urge to impress, but literally to strike terror by display on a gargantuan scale. Great preparations were set on foot for the occasion. Carpenters and masons worked night and day to ensure that every building was well repaired and sprucely painted. Jewelers, goldsmiths, and featherworkers toiled ceaselessly to prepare finery for the dancing and feasting. Even the garden party element was not absent. Those charged with flower arrangements made their special preparations, abundant floral decoration being indispensable for the sacrificial ceremonies, whether for the temples where the rites took place, or the tribunes whence the spectators watched. On this occasion, determined efforts were made to attract the rulers of the yet unconquered territories. Channels of diplomacy were rather rudimentary. Ambassadors traveling at the peril of their lives and considering themselves fortunate if not killed or kidnapped by frontier guards. They even went by night, using unfrequented mountain tracks. The empire won by the great Moctezuma still dominated its subject peoples, and their presence could be counted upon. However, among those not yet subdued, its prestige had fallen to such depths under Tizoc that many rulers dared to reject the invitation, though to do so was tantamount to an insult, often taken to justify a punitive campaign. The rulers of Tlaxcala said that they could hold a feast at any time in their own city and at their own convenience. Those of other cities of the region gave like replies. Not surprisingly, the ruler of the triumphant Tarascans rejected the invitation out of hand, recalling the recent humiliation of the Aztecs. "You must surely be demented. First you want war, and then you seek peace. How could I feel secure eating and drinking in your midst after you have treated me as you did?" The poor messengers, nonplussed, replied, "Mighty lord, There is a time set apart for hostilities and a time to be dedicated to our neighborly obligations, one to another. And thus says my lord and king that, setting aside enmity and war, he begs you that as a kinsman and relative, you and your nobles may come to honor him in his coronation. That the people might not suspect a secret understanding at their expense, they could make their entry under the cover of darkness. Their message was of no avail. The Tarascan ruler said that Ocelot could be crowned when and where he liked. Neither he nor any of his people would consent to be present. In spite of the almost frantic exertions undertaken to secure a good attendance, the ruler of Cholula was one of the few free princes to come, having been virtually bribed by the promise of lavish gifts. Special instructions were issued to stewards from subject provinces that nothing should be left undone to ensure his comfort. After the guests had assembled, 1,000 victims from recent wars were sacrificed. Endless ceremonies and ritual dances continued for 4 whole days, and 4 different types of songs were intoned, belonging to 4 distinct peoples. In a single day, the gifts were distributed equivalent to the tribute received in Tenochtitlan in 1 whole year. Some idea has already been given the huge amounts that were received. For example, 33,000 handfuls of feathers were delivered annually. It is as if the whole revenues of the British Empire, including all the jewels to be found in India, had been given away at the coronation of Edward VII. Only a penchant for display and obsessive proportions could explain such largesse. This celebration was to set the tone for the reign of Ocelot, a man who did nothing by halves. Soon after this ceremony, the news broke that the whole Aztec province was up in arms. This, it will be recalled, had been partly conquered by Ocelot, but Ocelot was not a man to undertake such a campaign lightly, nor to endure its hardships unsupported. He therefore summoned all the other rulers and told them that it was his will that all should themselves take part in the war. On this occasion, everyone complied. The armies were rapidly mobilized, and Ocelot ordered a forced march to the enemy borders, in order that a surprise attack could be mounted, leaving them no time to prepare their defense. Subject cities located on the line of march were detailed to provide the expedition with all the necessary supplies and with additional complements of warriors. The Señor of Huachinango himself joined the army, and invited Ocelot to stay in his place. The latter, however, replied, "It is not fitting for a good king and a brave captain to leave his own encampment." Like the soldier king that he was, he preferred to share all the discomforts of his troops. The subject ruler had to content himself with sending baskets of food and flowers to his master's tent. Ocelot then gave his usual address to the army, adding this time a salutary warning to the effect that those who did not fight with all their might would be deprived of rank and office. As a forceful commander, he sought to inspire both fear and affection in the men he led. As a preface to operations against the principal enemy city, Xiucoac, a reconnaissance force numbering 1,200 men entered the field surrounding the city and captured those who guarded them. 200 more scouts were then sent ahead, and once again that infallible Mexican ruse, the ambush, played its part in victory. The unsuspecting enemy were drawn upon, trapped, and attacked from all sides, many being killed or captured. The defeated rulers regaled Ocelot with huge presents, including many parrots and macaws. Quite apart from the supplies of feathers sent as tribute, many live birds were kept in Tenochtitlan, their feathers being periodically plucked. The Aztec army, after a period of well-earned rest and feasting, set out for the capital, accompanied by an endless train of prisoners. It was the Aztec custom to pierce the nostrils, and this proved convenient to their captors, who simply threaded them together by the nose so that they had to walk in long lines. As they went, they sang mournful songs and emitted loud lamentations. The girl captives and children, whose noses were not similarly perforated, were secured by the usual wooden collars fastened to their necks. As the triumphant army reached Tenochtitlan, there was great rejoicing on all sides. The prisoners were distributed to the various districts of the city. Speeches of welcome were addressed to them, and they were given food and flowers as well as special clothing, and cacao, the beverage normally reserved for the ruling classes. Soon after this campaign, in 1487, or 1 year after the ruler's accession, the Great Temple, after its latest transformations, ordered by Tizoc, was finally complete. This was a unique event, to be the occasion for ceremonies on a stupendous scale. The usual invitations were sent out, both to subject kings and to independent rulers. As a refinement on the customary summons, subordinate princes were themselves instructed to bring sacrificial victims to complement the myriads already mustered by the Mexica. From the numbers alone, it is clear that these did not all derive from the latest campaign just described. Already in his brief spell as ruler, Ocelot had also conducted preliminary expeditions in other directions to lay the groundwork for future conquests on the Pacific coast and towards the Guatemalan border, and these undertakings yielded their rich haul of prisoners. This time, Ocelot was in earnest, to reject his invitation was to constitute a casus belli. The unfortunate ambassadors who were to convey this missive faced the usual hazards of their profession, and went their way filled with premonitions that, instead of returning safely, they might become a prey to the wild beasts. However, after their master's initial blitzkrieg, his fame had already spread far and wide, as a man to be held in awe. On this occasion, none dared to refuse his bidding, and even the Tarascan ruler sent a friendly reply. The Tlaxcalans went so far as to offer profuse apologies for having rejected his previous invitation. When the envoys returned safely, bringing the acceptance of the various rulers, Ocelot displayed the keenly inquiring side of his mind. He interrogated them closely on the customs of the peoples visited, their temples, houses, ceremonies, gods, and even the food and drink which they served to his messengers. The foreign potentates now began to arrive. All entered secretly and at night. It was never considered fitting that the common people should observe that their rulers could at times compose their differences. To their simpler way of thinking, nations were either always friends or always enemies. Any contrary notions might weaken their martial ardor. To the popular mind, the cult of war was not consistent with the idea of a truce. The rulers, after this furtive entrance, were all greeted by Ocelot, received their first installment of lavish gifts, and were feasted with special foods. Everything was ordered and arranged with the determination to make manifest the greatness and supremacy of Mexico to their enemies, guests, and foreign visitors, and to fill them with fear and trepidation, as the sight of how Mexico lorded it over its whole realm, so extensive and fruitful, and with so many subject nations as at its command. All of this, the riches to be consumed, was delivered to the royal treasurer or steward in order that he should distribute it, in conformity with the orders given, more especially that he should provide for the requirements of the priests for the service of the gods and the ceremonies to be performed, and secondly, that all necessary materials should be furnished to the metal workers and stone cutters, and to the feather workers, for the purpose of making jewels, feather ornaments, diadems, and other beautiful objects, to be presented to the kings and great lords, that thereby not only should the grandeur and sumptuousness of Mexico be made evident, but also that the great feast of the renovation and completion of the temple should be duly solemnized. The most elaborate preparations were made for the ceremony, including the repainting of the other temples of the city. Nowadays, the eye is accustomed to the sight of the stone of which the outer crest of the pyramids was built. This for restored Mexican monuments has become an accepted convention, and we are apt to forget that the temples were generally thickly coated with stucco, brightly painted on the surface. In the absence of modern mortar, the stucco helped, incidentally, to hold the temple together. The population of neighboring cities was ordered to come to the capital on pain of death. No one was to miss such a ceremony, and not a man, woman, or child was to be found in their streets. The poor captives themselves, duly painted and feathered, were formed into interminable queues, stretching along the three main causeways into the city, to the north, south, and west, while the fourth line extended eastwards to the lagoon shore. It is traditionally related that they numbered 80,400, a figure repeated by several sources, but to slay and dispose of such a number in a city which might have numbered 300,000 is a manifest impossibility. It would have been the equivalent of today killing millions in a few days in London, or even Mexico City. As for the figures of enemy forces given by the Spanish conquistadors, great caution has to be exercised, even to the point of perhaps eliminating 1-0. In that case, even a figure of 8,400 might seem far-fetched. Huitzilopochtli, supported by the allied rulers of Texcoco and Tacuba, as well as the woman snake, or Giuacoat, heir to the great Tlacaelal, initiated the sacrifice, accompanied by throngs of priests. Both these and their victims were dressed as the different gods. Huitzilopochtli and his co-rulers first celebrated the occasion with a very good lunch, and then proceeded to the temple, gaily decorated with flowers, and mounted the steep steps. The sacrifice lasted 4 whole days. When Huitzilopochtli and his royal colleagues wearied of gashing open the victims' breasts, the priests took up the sacrificial cudgels in their place. Streams of blood flowed everywhere and even congealed beneath the steps of the temple. By the 5th day, the massacre was complete, and the Tlatoani bade farewell to his guests. The enemies from the independent states left secretly at night, their canoes piled with gifts. The oarsmen were forbidden to disclose the nature of their mission. The penalty for any infringement of this order would be death for themselves and destitution for their womenfolk. Huitzilopochtli also richly rewarded the subject princes who had attended, as well as the various bodies of artisans who had contributed so much to the resounding success of the occasion. There is no exercise more defeating to the contemporary mind than to seek to comprehend even dimly the ancient Mexican approach to human sacrifice. The shock suffered by our susceptibilities when faced with slaughter on this scale obstructs any objective assessment of their civilization as a whole. The Spanish conquerors were genuinely horrified at such practices, imposing a barrier between their religion and that of the Indians. In many ways, it is remarkable that higher civilizations could develop in virtual isolation from those of the Old World, and yet reproduce, albeit in varying forms, institutions and customs corresponding quite closely, such as kings, nobles, councils, knights, wars, judges, law courts, and markets, and even the practice of human sacrifice. But despite such similarities, the approach to life in ancient Mexico was different in many respects. It is difficult enough for a European to fathom the mental process of the modern Mexican Indian, so remote from his own, to say nothing of his forebears of antiquity. The problem is further complicated by the very nature of our information on the subject. Much of our knowledge of thought and religion among the higher civilizations of the Old World derives from original documents, in the form of deciphered written texts. On the other hand, notwithstanding codices, poems, and songs, against Mexican religion mainly reaches us projected through a Spanish lens. The accounts of Sahagún and others, as gleaned from their informants, are admirable for their detail and insight. At the same time, however, something always appears wanting in what the Aztecs told the friars of their former faith. To take an obvious example, a plethora of data exists as to the eternal manifestations of Mexican religion, including excellent descriptions of its outward show, of all its endless pomp and ceremony. In particular, accounts abound as to the different forms of human sacrifice and the accompanying rites. But what is never exactly explained is why they did these things. We may know every detail of the finery worn and of the dances performed, but practically nothing of what passed through the minds of those participating. What, for instance, might have been the reaction of women and children summoned from Xochimilco to view Huitzil's Holocaust? Based on certain historical sources, modern writers tend to dismiss the subject somewhat perfunctorily, insisting simply that Aztec sacrifices were prompted almost entirely by the pressing necessity of keeping the sun on its daily course, thus saving their world from destruction. Now, while partly exact, such affirmations leave much unexplained. But before examining the actual motivation, certain other points need to be borne in mind when approaching this most inscrutable of problems. Firstly, it must not be forgotten that, for reasons hardly more comprehensible to the modern mind, other peoples of antiquity have generally practiced human sacrifice at some stage in their development, even if they later discarded it. This is true not only of Mesopotamia, where in the early dynasties slaves were immolated in the tombs of their royal masters, but equally of Egypt and China, not to speak of ancient Greece and Republican Rome, where the occasional immolation of a slave is easily forgotten. The offering of human life itself, the ultimate form of propitiation of the divine, is endemic to the development of our species, and any distinction between the Aztecs and other peoples is a mere question of degree. They possibly differed in their tendency to intensify the temple of sacrifice as their civilization matured, rather than the reverse, and even this supposition incurs the risk of overgeneralization. It would indeed appear that the Aztecs developed the practice of a mass sacrifice on a colossal scale, but we have no certainty that in this they were the real innovators. It may, however, be true that with the Aztec sacrifice grew from being an impulse to becoming an obsession. Such tendencies added a new element of insecurity to the whole situation, since ever greater offerings necessitated unceasing wars to which the energies of the whole state were geared. What may have been its origins, mass as opposed to individual, sacrifice undoubtedly existed at the time of the conquest, and it has to be admitted that such a practice, unlike the sacrifice of individuals, is an unusual phenomenon, even if it has occurred also in other places, such as West Africa. Even if they accelerated the pace, the Aztecs, however, did not invent human sacrifice in Mexico, let alone elsewhere. Evidence exists from Teotihuacan of a human sacrifice 1,000 years before the Aztecs appeared, in the presence of sacrificial knives, the portrayal of human hearts, blood as a sacred element, as well as the cult of the flayed god, and the existence of the eagle and Ocelot knights, who performed the gladiatorial ceremony dedicated to his cult. The frescoes of the civilization may depict scenes of paradise, almost hedonistic in their verdant beauty, but the reality may have been grimmer. Their leading deity, the rain god Tlaloc, was certainly not averse to human offerings, particularly children, and of the sacrifices to mark the 20-day months of the Aztec ritual calendar, more were dedicated to this deity than to their own god, Huitzilopochtli. Thus, even in the Mexican Golden Age, indications exist that life was not so peaceful or idyllic as the fine serenity of their works of art might imply. There is evidence of human sacrifice and more, whether on the high plateau or on the Maya lowlands. Here, the cutting out of hearts is portrayed in exquisite reliefs. Frescoes show victors dragging captives by their hair, and an occasional trophy head is carried as an adornment. The notion of the Aztecs as the sole villains of this piece appeals more to the unenthusiastic amateur than to the professional investigator, obligated to seek deeper perspectives. Moreover, to be fair, it must be recalled that however much such proceedings shocked the Spaniards, the Aztecs in their turn were horrified by the Spanish practice of burning people alive, not as a sacrifice, but for common crimes, as well as for religious deviation, or equally by the branding of the captives as slaves, a practice unknown in ancient Mexico, where they enjoyed well-established rights as human beings, not as mere chattels. The Aztecs would never have tortured one of their own rulers, as the Spaniards did Cuauhtemoc, to satisfy a lust for gold. Such points, however, mainly relate to our attitude to the question. What still remains unanswered is, what was their attitude? The usual explanation given, the pressing necessity to keep the sun on its course, and the world in existence, is at least in part true. The legend of creation of the fifth sun, and of its eventual destruction by earthquakes, has already been explained. Man thus lived on borrowed time, obsessed by the need to appease the gods, to lengthen its span, and to avert the day of doom. Conquest of empire was not a mere urge, but a necessity, to secure enough victims that the gods might consent to keep the world in being. It was not a case of placating them in order to live better, but simply to stay alive at all. It is also true, as such accounts suggest, that many sacrifices were dedicated to the sun, or to Huitzilopochtli, partly himself a sun god. It must, however, constantly be borne in mind that human beings were offered not only to this deity, but also to countless others, each with its prescribed ritual and its due form of sacrifice. For instance, victims of the fire god would be burnt, those of the rain god often drowned, and those of the god of hunting pierced with arrows. Each 20-day month had its particular fasts and sacrifices, mostly connected with very ancient gods. It is thus clear that much sacrifice was devoted to other ends than that of simply keeping the world in being. When talking to the Spaniards of their old gods, Moctezuma and others usually refer to the necessity to appease them, not only to ensure victory in their wars, but also abundance in their harvests. Such accounts do not mention the need to save the world from destruction. Perhaps, however, the most fundamental difficulties confront us when we examine the status and attitude of the victims themselves. It is probably not incorrect to maintain that they were offered at times to Huitzilopochtli as the sun, But in the main, the victims tend themselves to become the god to whom they would be sacrificed. Now, it is difficult to conceive of a prisoner being offered to a god if he already was the god concerned. In a sense, therefore, they died as the god, not for the god. The captives are frequently referred to as the sons of the sun, and it has already been related on how so many occasions they were feted and honored, and how, when sacrificed, they were dressed in the attire of the deity himself. They even in certain cases perform actions characteristic of the god, and pertaining to the legends of his life. This personification of the god by the victim helps to explain the apparent lack of resistance to being sacrificed. On the one hand, we know of the extraordinary ritual whereby the prisoner would address his captor as a beloved father, while the latter would call his captive, my beloved son. It would seem, in fact, that the actual captor was the deciding factor. Once this had taken place, the captive even considered himself as chosen by the sun or by the god, and thus specially honored. His sacrifice then became not merely a voluntary act, but almost the incidental culmination of a chain of happenings already preordained from the moment when he was originally taken prisoner. Such was a deeply imbued code of ethics, so utterly incomprehensible to ourselves. Modern war may claim its victims among civilians and soldiers alike, but the idea of a purely voluntary death is not usually present, even among those who are glad to offer themselves for the most hazardous missions, but who at least try to stay alive. But in Mexican history, many examples exist, both of willing acceptance of death on the sacrificial stone, and also of actual insistence on being offered to the gods once capture had taken place. The most striking case is that of Tlahuicole, the Tlaxcalan made prisoner in the reign of Moctezuma II. After capture, he led a successful Mexican expedition against the Tarascans. Thereupon, the Tlatoani offered him his liberty, but he asked to be sacrificed. Before succumbing, he killed 8 gladiators using only the traditional pole, armed with feathers. A further example is offered by the 2 young men taken at the time of Pedro Alvarado's unfortunate temple massacre during Cortez's absence from Tenochtitlan. They indignantly rejected his offer of release and demanded to be sacrificed. What must surely have strengthened this attitude of abnegation and the willingness to accept death was not just the presence of a degree of Oriental fatalism, absent in the Western mind. In addition, certain positive beliefs were held concerning rewards in the afterlife. It was the warriors killed in battle or sacrificed after capture who went to dwell in the house of the sun, and who accompanied the morning sun, Huitzilopochtli, on the first part of his daily journey. On arriving in the west, he was greeted by another privileged group, the women gods, or Chihuateteo, the women who had died in childbirth, producing cannon fodder for the Aztec armies. Even these fortunate warriors did not enjoy their privilege indefinitely. After 4 years of the joys of accompanying the sun, they returned to earth in the guise of hummingbirds and lived on forever, sipping the wild honey. Apart from the hummingbirds' associations with Huitzilopochtli in ancient Mexico, it is perhaps of interest that this little bird still enjoys otherworldly associations. It is not unusual for experts in the occult to advise the acquisition of a mummified hummingbird. These are then usually wrapped in red thread, and candles are placed daily before them, that they may calm the evil spirits. Victims sacrificed to the rain god, together with those who died by drowning or of dropsy, leprosy, and venereal diseases, went straight to the verdant paradise of this deity, and were thus also a privileged clan. But the remainder of mankind, whether prince or pauper, faced a dismal future. They were consigned to the 9th underworld, where they would be cloistered under the grim guardianship of the god of the netherworld. The sugar candy skulls sold all over Mexico City on the Day of the Dead, 2nd November, recall drawings of this god to be found in codices. Even to reach his dark and uninviting realm, they passed 4 years in a kind of purgatory, and then crossed a great river with the help of a little dog, often buried with their remains. Unlike the great dog Cerberus, its task was to facilitate entry into the underworld, not the reverse. Important future incentives were thus offered to the victim of sacrifice. In addition, the community as a whole was impelled towards mass offerings of human life by its pessimistic philosophy. The world of the fifth sun was but a fleeting one, and the inescapable destiny of city and empire was to strive ever onwards and upwards in a vain effort to keep the sun in the sky. One factor entirely absent from such slaughter was any feeling of hate or cruelty. On no account was it held wicked to sacrifice men to the gods. On the contrary, it would have been gravely sinful not to do so. Moctezuma was constantly at pains to explain this to Cortes. While we ourselves are no more capable than the Spanish conquerors of condoning or even comprehending such practices, they must, however, be accepted as a fundamental element in Mexican civilization. Huitzilopochtli was now lusting for new lands to conquer, and he scanned the list of invited guests in search of absentees. As a result, he sent messengers to Tlaloloapan, now an attractive village, but then the chief city of an important province, lying to the southwest of Taxco and about halfway between Tenochtitlan and the Pacific coast. The Mexican envoys, disguised as merchants, went on to inquire why these people had not attended the inauguration of the Great Temple. They returned to tell Huitzilopochtli that the people of Tlaloloapan had shut themselves up in their city, no longer desiring to enter into relations with any neighboring power. The Aztec army marched rapidly to its rendezvous, and at this point Huitzilopochtli sent instructions to his Texcocan and Tacuban colleagues concerning preparations for the attack. To his utter fury, he was told that neither one had accompanied his army, pleading old age as an excuse. Huitzilopochtli, short-tempered at the best of times, upbraided the leaders of his Texcocan and Tacuban allies, threatening to reduce them to the status of subject cities and to deprive the rulers of their foibles, their roses, and their perfumes. After a night march, Tlaloloapan was taken by storm, and a massacre followed as the streets ran with blood. Although heavy tribute payments were imposed, the punishment had been so severe that the people of the city never dared to revolt. The vanquished enemies now served as guides for the assault on two other cities, Alahuitzla and Ostoma. The people of the latter bitterly upbraided those of Tlaloloapan, complaining that they themselves had previously enjoyed peaceful relations with the Mexica. It was Tlaloloapan who had now set them at odds. Instead of peacefully trading their wares against the produce of the Mexican lagoon, these would in future be seized as tribute. They would rather die than comply. This little battle of words illustrates once more the Aztec mode of operation. They tended to make conquests in an ever-widening arc of territory, wherever their merchants had already established relations. As in British India, the flag often followed trade, the latter tending to dictate the pattern of military operations. In this particular instance, on the Aztec northwest frontier, the strategic necessities of shoring up the defenses against the Tarascans certainly also had to be taken into consideration. The people of Ostoma reaped a grim reward for their defiance. On Huitzilopochtli's orders, only boys and girls were spared, since they could be carried off to the capital and serve as a reward for the Mexican leaders. The remainder of the population was put to the sword, the people of Alahuitzla suffering the same fate. During the battle against the latter, an enemy captain had the temerity to fight his way up to the person of Huitzilopochtli. The Tlatoani, however, fell upon his assailant with such a demoniac fury that one crushing blow sufficed to split open his head in two places. The ruler now made his triumphal return to Tenochtitlan, being first welcomed royalty by the peoples of the newly conquered region. He then made a slow progress through provinces that lay on his route. Everywhere the subject rulers hastened to do homage to the proud conqueror. On arrival, the captives were accorded the prescribed ritual reception. On this occasion, they were even given an additional treat, consisting of a special quality of cacao, taken from their own province. On his return from the expedition, the ruler sent for his faint-hearted colleagues of Texcoco and Tacuba. His rage at their abstention from his wars had apparently subsided, and he told them that he proposed to recolonize the two frontier posts, whose population he had butchered. He planned to send 400 people to the area from each of the three allied cities, and 1,200 more from neighboring subjects, making a colonizing force of 2,400 in all. Nasahuapili of Texcoco said that he greatly favored the idea of repeopling such areas, a policy already put into effect on other occasions. However, to take 400 people from Tenochtitlan, and presumably he also had in mind his own Texcoco, would impose an excessive population drain. He thought that 200 from each city would be sufficient. Moreover, he insisted on the voluntary principle, opposing Ahuitzot's notion that people could be forced to go. The latter did not venture to disagree with the sagacious Nasahuapili, and accepted his proposals. In this instance, as so often, his advice proved to be well-founded. It became unnecessary to resort to conscription. Those who volunteered to go actually exceeded the required total. They were lured on by the reputation enjoyed by their prospective home as an especially rich land, abounding in fruit, cotton, and nuts. The migrants were assembled in Tenochtitlan, and Ahuitzot gave them presents of clothing. Mexican leaders then addressed to them words of consolation at leaving home and family. They were once more reminded that they would enjoy great future prosperity. Moreover, it was the will of the gods that they should go forth. They were told that their first care must be to cultivate the cacao plantations, specially set aside for the ruler of Tenochtitlan. Furthermore, they must always be on the alert, since their land lay on the frontier between the Empire and Tarascan territory. Arrangements were made for their reception at various places on their route, and on arrival they were given lands and houses. In addition, they were presented with a ruler of their own, the choice being confirmed by Ahuitzot. This colonizing episode throws a revealing light on the politics of the empire. It is not so much the event itself that is significant, but its apparently exceptional nature. It is easy to appreciate the need for reliable defenders of this vital sector of the Tarascan border, and Nasahuapili was no doubt correct in citing previous applications of the principle of colonization. The practice was not, however, general, and in this the empire differed fundamentally from that of the Inca. The latter frequently consolidated conquered territories by establishing groups of their own kin. It may, of course, be true that in many parts of the empire, for instance, the coastal region in the vicinity of Veracruz, there were people who spoke Nahuatl. The Mexica, however, enjoyed no monopoly of this tongue, and in the great majority of cases were not immigrants brought in as act of policy. Their presence was often the result of previous movements of population long before this time. The sources of Aztec history, so rich in stories of wars and battles, give a careful account of this particular act of colonization, and would have surely mentioned other examples had they existed. The intervention of Nasahuapili in Ahuitzot's plans sheds an interesting light on the different characters of the two princes, the one a towering conqueror, the other an astute salesman. Ahuitzot will lead his armies to conquests ever more remote, whilst hurling torrents of abuse at the absent Nasahuapili for preferring the flesh pots of Texcoco to the rigors of the camp. When, however, the two rulers met, the impetuosity of the one would often yield before the wisdom of the other. One should, nonetheless, not exaggerate the lack of marital ardor in Nasahuapili or suggest that he was a coward. Copious accounts exist of his warlike activities, particularly in his earlier life. His main apologist even credits him with having himself killed 6 kings. However, the tendency of Ahuitzot to dominate the military operations of the Triple Alliance more absolutely than his predecessors inevitably further increased the power of Tenochtitlan at the expense of Texcoco. In a community where marital prowess was the supreme virtue and conquest the main motivation, primacy in war was the ultimate source of power. Moreover, in view of the close connections between trade and war, economic strength tended also to derive from the latter. Increasingly, one feels that Texcoco, notwithstanding the claims of its historians, was losing its remaining physical power within the alliance, even if it retained moral influence. This was shown by the clear supremacy of Tenochtitlan when the Spaniards arrived, only some 30 years after these events. That Texcoco still enjoyed great prestige was something of a tour de force on the part of Nasahuapili. Like his father, a man of such outstanding personality. Like a Talleyrand or even a Charles de Gaulle, he was able to maintain the status of his country at a level no longer to be accounted for by the mere yardstick of physical strength. Possibly Nesahualcoyotl, as the founder of empire, was the greater figure of the two, and was cast in a sterner mold. The father may have outmatched the son as a warrior, but in the arts of peace the latter was his equal. Both rulers, their wisdom aided by relative longevity, added nobly to the glories of Texcoco. Moreover, Nesahualpili succeeded in maintaining at a high level the Texcocan stock in spite of a gruesome incident which did little to enhance his popularity in Tenochtitlan. Ashayakat, when ruler, had sent his daughters to Nesahualpili in order that he might select from among them a legitimate queen. He chose a maiden called Chalchiomenetzin, and also retained the other daughters of his colleague as concubines. The curious practice prevailed whereby the ruler would possess additional wives, also of noble or royal birth, to ensure the succession in case the legitimate queen produced no heirs. The princess chosen as queen was assigned her own palaces and lived in great state. She was served in all by 2,000 menials. The latter respected her for her feigned gravity. Appearances, however, were apt to deceive, and she grew up to display a diabolical character. Left to her own devices, she sought pleasure with any gallant youths or fine gentlemen who came her way. The brief romance once terminated, she had her suitor killed. Then she would have made a kind of statue of the victim, which she adorned with rich garments and placed in her boudoir. Nesahualpili himself commented upon the presence of so many of these human likenesses in her apartments, and was told that they were her gods. The Mexica enjoyed such a reputation for devoutness that he believed this unlikely tale. But such atrocity could not remain forever undetected. The female Bluebeard made her great mistake when she spared the lives of 3 paramours. These included a prince, who was a grandee of the court of Texcoco in his own right. Nesahualpili chanced to recognize on his person a much prized jewel which he had given to his consort. He hid his anger, but, on the following night, made his way into her quarters, where she was supposedly asleep. In her bed, he merely found a figure that was her living likeness. She herself was immediately discovered in compromising circumstances with her 3 gallants. Texcoco was a state where the rule of law prevailed, even where the sovereign was concerned. The latter accordingly referred the matter to his judges. A royal commission was set on foot, and inquiries were made of all concerned, including the palace servants, and even the purveyors who, by appointment to Her Majesty the Queen, had made the statues. Nesahualpili informed the rulers of Tenochtitlan and Tacuba of the results of this inquisition, and of the future execution of the culprits. He then sent for all the subject rulers with specific instructions that they should bring their wives and daughters, however young. He was determined that the lesson should be lost on none, and that the penalties of infidelity should be engraved once and for all, even on infant minds. He went so far as to declare a truce with enemies, in order that they too should send representatives to the ceremony. Evidently, the execution of a queen was equal in attraction to the best of sacrificial ceremonies, and such was the interest aroused that space was lacking in Texcoco for all the visitors. The 4 offenders, the princess and her lovers, were strangled, and, as befitted people of high birth, their bodies were burnt, together with the statues of her previous victims. To put it mildly, the Mexica were rather vexed at the slaying of their ruler's niece, but postponed their vengeance. Nesahualpili, notwithstanding his intellectual preeminence, displayed, like his father, a marked streak of cruelty. His own eldest son and heir, among his other qualities, was gifted as a poet and philosopher, like his father and grandfather before him. However, he was rash enough to let his talents get the better of him, and composed a lampoon, making fun of the Lady of Tula, already referred to as a blue stocking of note, and as the ruler's favorite concubine. She was also something of a poetess, and a kind of war of words in verse ensued. Such conduct, however, constituted a clear case of lèse-majesté, and the prince was subject to the death penalty, much as his father loved him. He was executed, and his palaces were all closed up. Nasahuapili's second legitimate son was no more fortunate. He erected palaces to which he had no right. Even the heir to the throne was not entitled to do this unless he had first taken 4 captives in war. He was also executed. But the ruler was not only relentless in applying the law to his own family. He was equally insistent on the observance of the correct legal procedures in more general cases. He, for instance, had a judge condemned to death for hearing a legal case in his house and not in the courts, as required by law. Another judge was killed for pronouncing an unjust sentence. Moreover, he substantially implemented the body of legislation established by his father, adding such provisions as permanent exile for soldiers who committed adultery, and the right of sons of slaves to go free. It is worth noting once more that the status of the latter was strictly regulated in ancient Mexico. Such theories might seem to be exaggerated, were they not told by the chroniclers of Texcoco itself. Like all great rulers, he had his weak points, and doubtless found himself at times in a somewhat anomalous position, being by instinct a thinker more than a fighter, in a society where the arts of war were paramount. Nasahuapili may have possessed the brains of the alliance, but it was Tenochtitlan who controlled the sinews of war. The campaign previously described was only the beginning of the drive to the Pacific. Ocelot had now consolidated an important sector of the Tarascan frontier, and Ostoma in particular became a key fortified city and one of a series of bastions destined to withstand attack from this adversary. While large tracts of land had been absorbed in the process, even Ocelot realized his limitations. His Tarascan policy was mainly defensive in orientation, and he never resorted to all-out invasion. Probably between 1491 and 1495, using this recently dominated region in the northwest of modern state of Guerrero as a springboard, Ocelot made a great push towards the sea. Acapulco itself is included in the conquest lists for his reign, and he achieved the subjection of a vast stretch of coastal territory, running from Acapulco in a northwesterly direction for about 150 miles, as far as Zacatula. This long-range thrust along the coast was made partly for economic reasons, but was also an outflanking movement directed against the Tarascans. As can be seen from Map 5, the border of the latter almost ran due south until a point not too far distant from the ocean. Here it turned northwest, not reaching the actual coast before the distant Zacatula, the farthest point attained by the forces of the empire. The map also shows that the frontier of the unconquered Yopi tribes lay not far to the east, leaving a relatively narrow corridor which connected the new coastal province with the rest of the empire. However, these Yopis were a relatively primitive people and doubtless presented little threat to the Aztec lines of communication. The conquered coastal region hardly nowadays constitutes a leading agricultural area. However, in ancient times, its importance was great and its carefully terraced hills produced bountiful crops. It now was to become a leading supplier of cotton, providing 800 bales as its annual tribute. One of the most alluring parts of all of Mexico is the state of Oaxaca, whose capital city of the same name lies some 300 miles to the southeast of the city of Mexico. It is a land of rugged peaks, interspersed by fertile valleys. Even on the modern road, the traveler must negotiate an infinite succession of twists and turns before finally emerging into one of the world's most beautiful valleys, where lies the state capital. The whole region, including other neighboring valleys, contain important centers of population ever since the higher civilization had made its appearance in Mexico. The site, now known as Monte Alban, on the outskirts of the city of Oaxaca, had already risen to prominence nearly 2,000 years before the arrival of the Aztecs in the area. And just as the region was of continuous importance in pre-Hispanic times, so also it was greatly valued by the Spanish themselves, being the main center for the cultivation of cochineal, one of the most important products of New Spain. It was also a principal source of gold. The many beautiful churches both in the city and outside bear witness to its significance in colonial times. It had already produced these commodities in pre-colonial days, paying an annual tribute to the Aztecs of 20 gold discs the size of an average plate, and each as thick as a man's forefinger, as well as 20 bags of cochineal. Moctezuma I had made conquests in the northwestern part of the state, and had probably penetrated yet farther. It seems, though, the more descriptive sources say little, that the area immediately surrounding the city of Oaxaca was already raided and probably conquered by Huitzilopochtli in the early years of his reign in 1488 or 1489. Like the conquest of the Pacific coast, this was achieved not by a single lightning thrust but by a series of expeditions, the first taking place in the third or fourth year of his reign, while the absorption of other centers of population, apart from Oaxaca itself, was only completed by 1495. The region, though never fully subdued by Huitzilopochtli, then became an important tributary province, providing, apart from the gold and the cochineal, 400 bundles of richly worked mantles and 800 bundles of mantles of ordinary quality. The population of Oaxaca was predominantly Zapotec when the Aztecs arrived upon the scene. But for some time, this people had been deprived of political power, following an invasion by the Mixtecs. The great center of Monte Alban had thus been virtually abandoned for centuries, the Mixtec conquerors using it mainly as a place of burial. It was in their tombs that Dr. Alfonso Caso found such exquisite examples of gold work. Although so many Zapotecs had remained in the area, others had sacrificed home for independence and moved farther to the southeast towards Tehuantepec, the town at the southern extremity of the isthmus of that name, nowadays famed for the beauty of its women and for their colorful dress. Tehuantepec, so strategically situated, had become a key trading point for the merchants of the high plateau. From the time of Huitzilopochtli's earlier conquests, these had already enjoyed a certain degree of military protection. The possibility of invasion from Aztec possessions in Oaxaca was ever present, and the Mexica rulers were thus able to conduct their business on terms prejudicial to the customer. They foisted their unappetizing legume produce on the people of the isthmus, exacting in return from the reluctant buyers their cacao, gold, precious stones, and feathers. By the year 1496, the latter had had enough of waterflies, lagoon worms, and the like. They mobilized their forces, blocked roads, and killed some of the merchants. Their territory was even more distant than any previously conquered. Huitzilopochtli nevertheless decided to take the offensive, and a large army was assembled. The soldiers were eager to participate in the campaign, directed against cities famed for their riches and ripe for plunder. While the captains prepared for war, the quartermasters assembled large quantities of stores indispensable for such a march. So complete was the muster that in many places only women and children remained behind. Not a man was to be seen on the streets. On the fourth day after the army's departure, the women came forth in mourning clothes, plastering their hair with ashes, to mark the absence of their husbands, brothers, and sons. They abstained from washing their faces, hands, and clothes until the first news of victory would arrive. Before the morning star rose, they made fire and bored in braziers and incense burners, also containing rosin. They burned incense as an offering to the gods and goddesses, to the bones of captives previously sacrificed, and to their husbands, making prayer to the gods of war and to various demons, that they should give victory to their spouses. Having done this, they gave food to the gods, making white tortillas and large ones called papalo tlaxcali, maguey worms toasted in pans that they called xonequilin, and ground and toasted a little maize called itzquiotl. Beat it up in a new blue jar and served it to the gods, that they might drink it. The army was enthusiastically received by the population of the valley of Oaxaca, including the people of Mexica stock residing there. Huitzilopochtli, as usual commanding in person, summoned the local rulers to demand of them supplies and military reinforcements. The ruler of the Tehuantepec heard of this and threatened them with dire reprisals if they dared to join the forces of aggression. Various townships on the route were first taken, and the inhabitants massacred. Finally, as the main objective was reached and the troops drawn up for battle, on other occasions, Huitzilopochtli placed trained veterans between each group of 4 recruits. The army was so well drilled as to prove invincible, and the forces of Tehuantepec began to falter after losing several of their leaders. The Mexicans pursued, again killing without mercy. The victors proceeded to pillage the dead, removing their rich adornments of feathers and precious stones. Huitzilopochtli himself was more anxious to secure continuous supplies of such prized trophies, now being offered as tribute by the chiefs. Consequently, he ordered that the fighting and robbing should cease. The Mexican captains, however, had to resort to force, holding back their own soldiers to stop the looting and slaughter. Undeterred by such attempts, they continued to break into the houses of the city, sacking as they went until eventually restrained by their leaders. The troops were incensed at this limitation of their rights. The promised reward for their exertions lay solely in pillage or in war booty. The latter was distributed officially, but probably on a more parsimonious scale, the lion's share going to the ruler and his generals. The soldiers swore that never again would they march so far if they were not to share the fruits of victory. Ocelot, however, once more won them to take his side, promising that he personally would make up their losses. Such murmurings might at first sight appear as nothing but minor incidents. They are, however, of great moment, strongly suggesting that in undertaking far-flung conquests, the Aztec Empire was faced with the law of diminishing returns. However profitable to the state, such expeditions also created problems for which no real solution lay to hand. As the journey to the scene of operations became ever more exhausting, the enthusiasm of allies and subjects diminished in proportion. Such reluctance became apparent at all levels. The ruler of Texcoco stayed away, and the common soldiers complained. Ocelot had, however, settled such differences for the present, and the rulers of Tehuantepec gave him huge presents, apart from the tribute paid. The Tlatoani, courting the favor of the army, and true to his previous promise, departed from custom, and distributed all that he had received, keeping nothing back. By his action in halting the massacre, he had won over the people of Tehuantepec, who were to become firm allies in the future. Such has been the magnitude of his triumph that, on return to the capital, he was given a welcome such as no ruler had ever received before. Our descriptions of the campaigns of Ocelot and his predecessors included details giving some idea of Aztec methods of war. In some ways these are so similar, in others so different to those of the Old World. The Spaniards themselves provided much information on native tactics and weapons, but rather less in the organization of a campaign. Moctezuma II had taken part in many an expedition in the course of his lifetime, both before and after he succeeded to Ocelot. It is perhaps a pity that he did not enlarge on the subject during the long hours spent conversing or playing parlor games with his Spanish captors. Detailed accounts of wars and warlike preparations do, however, exist in plenty. For instance, in addition to what his informants told Padre Sahagun about the merchants' expeditions, they also supply many details about the conduct of war. Quote, "The ruler was known as the Lord of Men. His charge was war. Hence he determined, disposed, and arranged how war would be made. First, he commanded the masters of the youths and seasoned warriors to scan the enemy city and to study all the roads, where they were difficult, where entry could be made through them. This done, the ruler first determined, by means of a painted plan, how was placed the city which they were to destroy. Then he summoned the general and commanding general and the brave warriors, and he commanded them how they were to take the road, what places the warriors were to enter, for how many days they would march, and how they would arrange the battle. The Aztec High Command thus had claim to a most adequate intelligence service. This is equally apparent from the close watch which Moctezuma II's observers were to keep on the movements of the Spanish invaders, even to the point of supplying Cortes with news of further ships reaching the coast of Mexico. Continuous streams of painted plans flowed back to Moctezuma, giving lurid details of the exotic visitors. Where long-range information was concerned, the merchants naturally played a leading role. As distinct from such strategic intelligence, tactical data on the enemy order of the battle was the responsibility of scouts. Descriptions of various campaigns place emphasis on their activities. At times, a full reconnaissance party would be sent forward, sufficient to penetrate the enemy defenses. Surprise was, however, not usually sought in battle. We hear of night marches, but battles normally took place by day. Furthermore, with certain exceptions, war was only undertaken after a ritual declaration involving not one, but several embassies to the enemy ruler. As emphasized by Sahagun's account, it was the Tlatoani himself who made the plans, after he had consulted the leading commanders. The precise calculations as to route, timing, and battle orders scarcely savor of primitive warfare, recalling rather operation orders issued before a modern battle. The account already quoted further mentions that the major demos from places as distant as the Gulf Coast were included in the ruler's war council. Thus, the major war was an undertaking involving virtually the whole empire. Quote, "The ruler then consulted with all the major domos. He ordered them to take out all their goods held in storage, the tributes, costly articles, insignia of gold and Quetzal feathers, and all these shields of great price. And when the major domos had delivered all the costly devices, the ruler then adorned and presented with insignia all the princes who were already able in war, and all the brave warriors. In view of the distances involved, the supply question was paramount. Problems of logistics were further complicated by the voluminous quantities of fancy devices and insignia required, and considered quite as indispensable as arms and ammunition, serving partly as badges of rank. To us, such adornments might appear as an absurd encumbrance. However, in Mexico, war was conceived within a magical religious framework. The gods decided, and men merely executed their will. To secure victory, one first had to make sure that the former would be favorable to the outcome. Any failure, therefore, to comply with tradition or any attempt to discard the customary paraphernalia would be fatal to one's chances. But apart from such ceremonial requirements, practical steps had to be taken regarding food and other necessities. As previously related, supplies of such standard victuals such as maize and beans were taken with the army, together with cooking vessels being carried to the scene of battle by porters. However, it was seldom possible for an expedition to carry all that it needed, and the Aztec forces partly lived off the land. Advance arrangements were made to collect food in subject cities lying on the line of march, and a grim fate awaited any that failed to comply. Subject peoples were often required, in addition, to provide extra levies, particularly in frontier districts. Such arrangements probably tended to be inadequate. The Aztec Empire, unlike the Inca, had no system of supply depots placed throughout its territory, depending instead on provisions produced by local potentates. Remembering that Soconusco, Ahuitzot's most distant objective, is nearly 800 miles by road from Mexico City, the problems involved must have been considerable, and the ruler forthwith called upon the rulers of Texcoco and Tlacopan, Tacuba, and the rulers in all the swamplands, and notified them to proclaim war in order to destroy a certain city. He presented them all with costly capes, and he gave them all insignia of great price. Then he also ordered the common folk to rise to go forth to war. Before them would go marching the brave warriors, the men-at-arms, the Lord General, and the commanding general. The importance of help rendered by allied and subject cities has already been stressed. Tenochtitlan could not have undertaken such conquests single-handed. Of much interest in the passage quoted is the reference to the calling up of the common soldiers, clearly not themselves part of any standing army. In the Spanish version of the same text, words are inserted to show that it was only when mobilized that the soldiers were supplied with weapons. In other words, they were not permanently under arms. We are told on various occasions that it was on the declaration of war that the young men undertook practice in the use of arms. The same was true of Texcoco, where Pomar makes it clear that the arts of war and the cultivation of soil went hand in hand. The lords of the sun, it was said, took charge and directed in war. All the priests, the keepers of the gods, took the lead. They bore the gods upon their backs, and by the space of one day marched ahead of all the brave warriors and the seasoned warriors. These also marched one day ahead of all the warriors of Tenochtitlan. Again, these marched one day ahead of all of the warriors of Tlatelolco. Although the battles were short, the marches were usually long and required to be carefully ordered. Once the destination was reached, the troops were drawn up for battle, quote, and when the warlike lands were reached, the brave warrior generals and commanding generals then showed the others the way and arranged them in order. No one might break ranks or crowd among the others. They would there and then beat or slay whoever would bring confusion or crowding among the others. All the warriors were extended there until the moment that Yacahuitzli, god of the night, would descend. That darkness would fall. And when they already were to rise against the city to destroy it, first was awaited tensely the moment when fire flared up, when the priests brought forth fire, and for the blowing of shell trumpets, when the priests blew them. And when the fire flared up, then as one arose all the warriors. War cries were raised. There was fighting. They shot fiery arrows into the temples. Sahagun's account says little of the actual battle, though other versions of such encounters abound. The Aztec forces were usually divided into squadrons according to nationality. The army tended to attack en masse, reminiscent more of a horde than a phalanx. The attacking force presented a dazzling spectacle as it rushed into the fray, bedecked with feathers and jewels, amid the deafening roar of the soldiers' battle cries, the chiefs' drums, and the priests' trumpets. Bows and arrows provided a kind of artillery barrage, accompanied usually by volleys of insults. The preferred tactics, however, involved hand-to-hand fighting, using heavy clubs armed with blades of obsidian. The traditional weapon of ancient Mexico, the spirit or atlat, continued to be used. Artistic representations of warriors usually depict this arm rather than the bow. Military tactics were somewhat unvaried. The inevitable stratagem was the ambush, which usually succeeded. As defensive weapons, the men carried shields and wore cotton armor, also to be adopted by the Spaniards. The defense was also conducted from prepared fortifications surrounding cities. Many towns along the Tarascan border were thus protected, though others less vulnerably placed, such as Texcoco, lay virtually open and unprotected. Barriers were often thrown up at the last moment. One has the general impression that the defense was weaker than the attack, which normally obtained its objective. And when the city had been overcome, thereupon were counted as many captives as there were, and as many Mexicans and Tlatelolcans as had died. Then they appraised the ruler that they had been orphaned for the sake of Huitzilopochtli, that the men had been taken captive and had been slain. And the ruler then commanded the high judges to go tell and inform all in the homes of those who had gone to die in war, that there might be weeping in the homes of those who had gone to war to die. And they informed those in the homes of as many as had gone to take captives in war, that they had received honors there because of their valor, and they were rewarded according to their merits. The ruler accorded favors to all: costly capes, breech clouts, chocolate, food and devices, and lip rods and earplugs. Even more did the ruler accord favors to the princes if they had taken captives. And if some had done wrong in battle, then them and theirs slew them on the battlefield. They beat them and stoned them. The outstanding feature of Mexican warfare was this obsession with the capture of prisoners. It may be one thing in modern war to surround pockets of enemy men, who are then obliged to surrender as a group. For the individual soldier to capture a single prisoner and drag him from a battle still in progress is quite another. But it was for such single-handed feats that a warrior gained status, and a disputed captive served no one. To abduct individual fighting men from the field of battle must have been extraordinarily complicated, and yet the conduct of war, if not entirely devoted to such exploits, was at least profoundly conditioned by this aim. It was not a mere question of honor. Actual military rank was governed by such norms. A man's progress in the Aztec hierarchy thus depended on his success in taking prisoners. A boy of 15 wore his hair shorn, but with a long tuft growing from the back of his head. If he never took a captive, thus he remained, and held no place of honor even if he were a prince. If he took a prisoner with the help of 5 or 6 others, as a kind of collective initiation into the art, most of his tuft of hair was removed, only a small part remaining, which reached down to one ear. At this point, he was addressed by an older warrior, referred to as his grandfather or beloved uncle. Thou hast taken another face, and thou hast gone to throw thyself against the foe. Let them take thee if, without profit, once more thou takest a captive with the aid of others. What wouldst thou be? Wouldst thou have a young girl's lock of hair? Take care lest thou against a captive with others' help cast thyself against our foes. In other words, only raw recruits could indulge in the initial luxury of collective capture and gain honor for it. From that point hence, the young man must take his prisoners unaided. Those who were successful were named leading youths, and their faces were stained with red ochre. And at that time Moctezuma granted him favors. He gave him an orange cape with a striped border and a scorpion design to bind on, and a carmine breech clout with long ends, and a breech clout of many colors. And he then began to wear capes with designs. Additional honors were claimed by those who had taken 3 captives, but only after a 4th capture was a man promoted to the title of seasoned warrior. He then consorted on equal terms with the great captains. These seasoned warriors, their rank depending on personal merit, constituted a kind of officer class of paramount importance in a military state. On the other hand, the great military commanders or leading captains tended to be related to the ruler, and thus became eminent by virtue of heredity as well as merit. Apart from such regular grades of warriors, who apparently only took up arms on declaration of war, there existed several orders of knights who possibly constituted a kind of standing force, very limited in number. The chief among these were the Eagle and Ocelot knights, who had already existed long before the age of the Aztecs. As with certain medieval knights, their order was religious as well as military in nature. They had special connections with certain temples, one of which still can be seen at Malinalco. The eagle and the Ocelot, or Jaguar, were symbols of bravery. It will be recalled how, after the creation of the fifth sun and moon, they both plunged into the fire, the eagle emerging completely darkened by the flames, and the Ocelot merely spotted. Apart from their leading role in the gladiatorial sacrifice, it seems that in war they fought as a separate body, or a kind of corps d'elite. For Huitzol's last and most ambitious campaign, pretexts varied from the usual pattern. In 1500, the people of Tehuantepec, now loyal subjects, found their resources insufficient to meet payments of tribute. In order to obtain extra produce, they sent their own merchants to trade with Soconusco, a province yet more distant. The people of the latter derided them for their new status as tributaries, calling them cowards and women and mere lackeys of the Mexicans. Soconusco lies on the borders of present-day Mexico and Guatemala. Even taking the distance as the crow flies, it is some 600 miles distant from Mexico City. An army following the endless twists and turns of mountain paths must have covered a greater distance. Undeterred by such problems, Huitzol determined to respond to the appeals of Tehuantepec. If he ignored them, this would be taken as a pretext for default on tribute and for rebellion. To any other ruler, such an enterprise might have seemed foolhardy. Large supplies were assembled for the distant venture. No one was permitted to absent himself on pain of death, except for the aged, children, and certain priests. Once more, Huitzol had trouble with his two allied rulers. Their enthusiasm for the 800-mile march was limited. In order to force their hands, Huitzol sent them arms and insignia such as only a sovereign prince could don. Such forceful hints fell upon deaf ears. The ruler of Tacuba pleaded old age. In spite of certain suggestions to the contrary, it appears that Nasahuapili also played truant, avoiding thus not only the great trek, but also the constant irritation of having to play second fiddle on such occasions to Huitzol. The latter naturally led his army in person. A past master in the simultaneous use of stick and carrot, he inspired his troops by stern example and his lavish prodigality. They in their turn promised not to return home before victory was achieved. Even on the outward march, the great conqueror received an almost godlike reception in Tehuantepec. In a munificent gesture of appreciation, he seated the local ruler on his right hand. The leading Mexicans served him as they did their own master. The army rested here for a few days, Huitzol remaining true to his custom of staying with his army, spurning the comforts of the city. After a further forced march, the enemy's strongholds were conquered one after the other, and finally Soconusco, from which the whole province was named. In the attack on the city, the Aztec armies displayed signs of war weariness. We are told that had it not been for the support of the people of Tehuantepec, whose journey had been much shorter, they might even have suffered defeat. Huitzol, as usual, came to terms with the local chiefs and gave orders that looting and killing should cease. Once more he encountered bitter protests. He persuaded the rulers of the province to give special gifts to his men as compensation for the booty foregone. This, in effect, was the only reward of the common soldier. The people of Soconusco were only too ready to indicate to Huitzol that further heights remained to scale. They told him of neighboring Guatemala, with which they were continuously at war. They would gladly assist him to conquer this land. Huitzol, as usual, came to terms with the local chiefs, and he gave orders that looting and killing should cease. Once more he encountered bitter protests. He persuaded the rulers of the province to give special gifts to his men as compensation for the booty foregone. This, in effect, was the only reward of the common soldier. The people of Soconusco were only too ready to indicate to Huitzol that further heights remained to scale. They told him of neighboring Guatemala, with which they were continuously at war. They would gladly assist him to conquer this land. Not surprisingly, he told them that his army was too exhausted for further expeditions. Such distant ventures may appear even more remarkable when it is recalled that other military operations had to be undertaken simultaneously. During the whole reign of Huitzol, we hear of periodical conflicts with the nearby peoples of the Puebla Tlaxcala Valley. Though perhaps of a partly ritual nature, aimed at securing prisoners, they were nonetheless hard fought. One such encounter occurred in 1499, or just before the march to Soconusco. As in many similar cases, the anniversary was the Huachozingo, The adversary was Huachotzinggo rather than Tlaxcala, which was only then rising to a position of predominance. The outstanding deed of bravery on this occasion was performed by a captain of Huachotzinggo. Hearing of the Aztec attack, when he was playing the ball game, he rushed to the scene of the battle without even having time to don his arms. As yet unarmed, he fought with such vigor that he killed several adversaries and fought on, using their weapons. After the battle, now the hero of the hour, Toltecat, was acclaimed ruler in Huachotzinggo. Owing to the opposition of certain priests, he was forced to abandon his throne. He fled into Aztec territory, where he was killed on the orders of Ahuitzotl, not always chivalrous towards his fallen foes. As the empire expanded, so also did the population of the capital and of the surrounding cities. Archaeological evidence suggests a considerable increase in the Valley of Mexico during the era of Pax Azteca. Notwithstanding the huge flow of tribute, it was not easy to provide food for such concentration of dwellings, almost an ancient conurbation, assuming proportions unknown before in Mexico. It was therefore essential to increase local production and augment the yield of the Chinampa system of cultivation in the vicinity of Tenochtitlan. For this purpose, greater quantities of sweet water were needed. Present supplies were inadequate, and some canals even tended to dry up at certain times of the year. With this end in view, it occurred to Ahuitzotl to harness the water from the abundant springs of Coyoacán, some 6 miles to the southwest, and bring them to Tenochtitlan. Accordingly, he sent word to the ruler of that city, telling of his plan. The latter replied that if these waters were most dangerous and difficult to control, if once unleashed, they could flood Tenochtitlan, since the lagoon lacked proper outlets and its level would simply rise. He therefore strongly advised that Ahuitzotl not utilize these springs, adding nevertheless that if his master insisted, he would obey. His pet project, thus criticized Ahuitzotl, flew into a rage. The members of his council tried to assuage his wrath. Furthermore, since the ruler of Coyoacán was much respected among them, they warned him of impending doom. However, rather than hide until the storm had passed, the latter relied for protection on the powers of the occult, in which he was greatly skilled. To such an extent did belief in the supernatural influence events that even a cruel assassination, such as that which followed, is related in a magical context. It might be added that the chroniclers themselves would not necessarily have disbelieved in their tales of magic, presumably inspired by the devil rather than the divine. We are told that Ahuitzotl sent his henchmen, who surrounded the palace of Coyoacán, found an entrance, and found upon the throne not the ruler, but a beautiful eagle. Dumbfounded, they rushed back to Tenochtitlan to report. They were ordered to return immediately in added strength, and this time were astonished to find a great serpent on the throne. It began to uncoil itself and prepared to attack them. Like a dragon, it seared them with flames, and they were forced to abandon the palace and flee to Tenochtitlan, in order to tell Ahuitzotl that they could not execute his commands. But Ahuitzotl was not a man to accept defeat at the hands of a mere magician. He now sent word to the other leaders of Coyoacán, telling them that they must deliver up their sovereign, or else he would make war and destroy them. To save his city, the ruler now surrendered his person to the envoy, saying, "You see me here. I place myself in your hands. But go and tell your lord Ahuitzotl that I prophesy that before many days pass, Mexico will be submerged and destroyed, and that his will be the fault for spurning my advice." He thereupon dressed himself in his royal robes, and put the robe around his own neck. This assassination, for such it was, caused consternation among Ahuitzot's advisors. In particular, the ruler of Tacuba was most distressed, since the victim was a close kinsman. It might be one thing occasionally to slay a remote provincial prince after a bitter war. It was quite another to kill the sovereign of a neighboring city in cold blood. It virtually amounted to an offense against the gods, whom this ruler, in his own spear, represented. And in the end, even Ahuitzotl himself felt remorse, and did his best to compensate the sons of the deceased. The ambitious project to harness the waters was now set in motion. A huge labor force was recruited, and each city was apportioned its particular task. The workers were so numerous as to resemble ants in an ant heap. When the aqueduct, when the aqueduct, was completed, the most elaborate religious ceremonies took place, dedicated to the god of rain and to the goddess of water. A veritable aquatic festival ensued, replete with every symbol of rain or water, so basic to Mexican religion, in which such deities and rites were among the most ancient. Practically all the participants were dressed in blue, the color characteristic of water deities. The chief priest, dressed as the water goddess herself, wore a blue cloak and diadem of heron feathers, symbolic of the rain god. His face was darkened with drops of melted rubber, another rain symbol, and his forehead was painted blue. His ears, lips, and wrists were adorned with green stones, a further sacred emblem. The other priests wore similar adornments, though their bodies were almost naked. When the chief priest arrived, dressed as the water goddess, he first drank the water, and then addressed it as if speaking to the goddess herself. "Precious lady, you come your way in most welcome fashion. It is the path which you have to follow henceforth. Thus I, representing your likeness, come to receive and greet you, and to welcome your arrival. See, my lady, that this is the day of your coming to your city of Mexico Tenochtitlan." After this, he sprinkled colored maize flour on the waters, while musicians devoted to the rain god and water goddess sang and danced in appropriate fashion. Old men brought earthenware jars filled with fishes, frogs, leeches, and water snakes, and cast them into the flow. The climax of the ceremony was still to come. 4 specially selected children of 6 years of age were held in readiness. They were now dressed exactly as the attendant clergy, their faces blackened with liquid rubber, stars painted on their foreheads, and their bodies festooned with green stones. As the water reached each of the 4 predetermined points, one of the infants was sacrificed, and the blood sprinkled on the stream. Finally, Ocelot himself came out and made obeisance to the oncoming current. After addressing it further homily, he stood at the point where the water fell from the aqueduct into the canal, and threw in the golden objects and precious stones, fashioned as fishes and frogs. Unfortunately, however, the forebodings of the murdered ruler of Coyoacan proved all too well founded. The flow was so abundant that soon the level of the lagoon began to rise, flooding some of the cultivated chinampas that lay between the canals. Other cities of the lagoon, as well as Tenochtitlan, were also inundated. All attempts to stem the flood by means of a great dam were of no avail. Houses and cultivated plots were submerged, and the people began to flee their homes. Ocelot was mortified. The hero of so many distant triumphs had met his Waterloo on the home front. He now even feared the wrath of the populace for the havoc which he had wrought. As a confession of his failure, he sent for Nezahualpóyotl of Texcoco. Apart from his renown as a sage, this ruler enjoyed equal fame as a magician. He was apparently glad of an opportunity to ingratiate himself. He had previously aroused the anger of the Mexica by the public execution of Ocelot's niece. At the same time, he must have been secretly delighted that this time it was he, not Ocelot, who could utter the reproofs. He spoke as follows: "Most powerful king, you have been long in seeking counsel. Earlier, the ruler of Coyoacan, Tutsumantzin, gave you his advice. Only of late has fear and dread seized you that you yourself in this noble city might be destroyed, something that you should have foreseen and considered long before. Know well that in the present battle it is not your enemies who are pressing you, for these by your valor you are well able to confound and expel from your city. Now you are fighting an element so relentless as the water. How can you resist and repair this situation? What had Tutsumantzin done? In what did he err? How did he offend? Was he a traitor, or did he plot against your royal crown? Was he perchance an adulterer or a thief? Recognize, most mighty lord, that you have offended and sinned against the gods, whose likeness this good ruler represented, and upon whose shoulders they had laid the burden of the government of his realm. And for that cause the Lord of creation now permits that this city should be destroyed and depopulated. How will it appear in the eyes of the enemy which surround us, when Mexico is emptied of its citizens, and you and your lords are compelled to flee, as an eternal vengeance upon you and upon them? What will they say, save that what your ancestors built with so much sweat and labor, you have destroyed in 40 days? My opinion is that the dam should be demolished, and that the water should follow its previous course. At the same time, a solemn sacrifice should be offered to the goddess of water, to appease her wrath against you, including many jewels and feathers, and numerous coils, together with incense, paper, and rubber, and simultaneously some children should be brought to be offered up. Perhaps by these means we shall calm and restrain her springs, so that they may pour forth less water. This revealing discourse shows that even the overweening Ahuitzotl was not absolute master in his own house. One wonders who would have dared to address the Emperor Charles V or King Philip II in like fashion. The speech well illustrates the Aztec propensity for blending the soundest common sense with the strangest superstition. The Texcocan monarch first recommends the only sensible course, namely to stop the flow of water at its source, rather than to block its later flow with ineffective dams. But such practical action, even for the sage of Texcoco, must needs be accompanied by further child sacrifices as an indispensable part of the whole plan. In peace as in war, no solution was complete, or indeed effective, without giving the gods their due. The rain god's favorite fare happened to be young children. To complete his rescue operation, Nasahuapili insisted that divers should be sought who were familiar with the springs of Goyoacan. To ensure that full atonement was made to the gods for the wrongs committed, he further suggested that, in addition to the children, a few leading Mexicans should be sacrificed, a proposal which surely sent a chill down the spine of some present at the meeting. 15 divers were produced who would eventually plunge into the water and found practical ways of stanching its flow. In this strictly technical undertaking, they received invaluable assistance from innumerable priests, dressed this time as the rain god himself, not as his sister, the goddess of water, and with their faces and bodies duly painted blue. That the material and religious aspects of the undertaking should proceed hand in hand, the divers were also painted the same color to honor the god. Such drastic measures proved effective, and the waters subsided, but only after taking a fearful toll of the city. A great work of reconstruction was needed. Vast numbers of canoes were marshaled to bring materials to the scene of action. The which reconstruction was now put in hand, and each province and nation rallied to the task, bringing staves, earth, and stone. With this, they stopped up the water in all the places where it had entered. Many old buildings remained beneath the flood, and they rebuilt Mexico with better constructions, more original and elegant in style, for the previous ones were ancient and had been built by the Mexica themselves in their time of poverty and need, and thus many were lowly and dilapidated. However, this time the nobles and others built to suit their fancy, using imported labor, each leader having a village or two assigned to him to help rebuild his house. And thus they painted as they wished, each one in his own style, as was their own custom. And so Mexico became very fine and spectacular, with large and unusual houses, filled with great extensions of garden and splendid patios. And so Mexico became very fine and spectacular, with large and unusual houses, filled with great extensions of gardens and splendid patios. The canals were now well controlled, and with willows and poplars, both light and dark in color, planted on their sides, with many defenses and embankments provided against the water, so that even if they became filled, no damage would be done. It may thus be observed that Ahuitzol's character was many-sided. At times the munificent conqueror, at other times the petty tyrant, venting his frustrations by his treatment of the ruler of Coyoacan. But not unlike other great campaigners, he not only conquered but also constructed. The solid masonry, designed to perpetuate his triumphs, was soon to be wondered at and then destroyed by a different kind of conqueror. Clearly much more than repairs were involved. The project amounted to a virtual rebuilding of the city with certain foreign influences, just as occurred in London after the Great Fire. Relatively few years remained before the arrival of the Spaniards, and it is therefore logical to suppose that most of what they were to behold existed before the death of Ahuitzotl. Under the impetus of his additions to the empire, the metropolis probably took on its final and resplendent form. The city, as well as the empire, had expanded at a vertiginous pace. Though started in previous reigns, the great temple and the surrounding edifices has also taken final shape under Ahuitzotl. The temple was part of a vast complex formed of 78 buildings and capable of holding 10,000 people at a time. This was surrounded by a wall surmounted by crenellations such as we still see protecting the atrium of many a 16th century monastery. The great ceremonial center of Tenochtitlan does not correspond exactly to the present Plaza de la Constitucion, but lay slightly to the west. The skull rack occupied part of the area where the Metropolitan Cathedral is now situated, with the Temple of the Plumed Serpent lying just behind and to the west. North of these, at the corner of the Calle de la República de Guatemala, some remains of the Great Temple have been excavated. It was surrounded by a wall of serpents, Coatlepantli, such as can still be seen at the site of Tenayuca. The temple itself conformed to the typical Aztec pattern, with double stairway and two sanctuaries at the top, one for Huitzilopochtli and the other for the rain god. In the principal one of these temples was a statue of Huitzilopochtli, who was also named Ilhuicat Chochouki. In the other stood the image of the god Tlaloc. In front of each of these was a round stone like a large block called Teshkat, where they killed those whom they sacrificed to this god. And from the stone down to the bottom was a flow of blood of those whom they slew, and thus it was in all the towers. Perhaps a characteristic, if rather somber, monument to Ahuitzot's achievements was the new skull rack, Tzompantli, which he installed. After the great sacrifice for the inauguration of the temple, so many new heads were forthcoming that they could not be accommodated on the previous rack. He accordingly ordered this to be burnt and a new one to be constructed in its place. Another well-known monument completed in this reign is the famous temple situated high above the hill on the village of Tepoztlan near Cuernavaca, and often known as Tezpotzteco. It is one of the few temples which can actually be dated, displaying the glyph of the year 10 Rabbit, or 1502, the last of Ahuitzot's reign. Nor should it be thought that the Mexica as a whole were nothing but rough soldiers whose artistic achievements were confined to monumental masonry, or that the arts were the exclusive province of Texcoco. Admittedly, Aztec pottery leaves much to be desired. The fastidious Moctezuma II dined off plates made of the delicate Cholula ware. On the other hand, a wealth of literature in the Nahuatl language has survived, including historical annals, poems, and sagas. At least part of these derive from Tenochtitlan and Tlatelolco. In their poignant grace, they reflect the Aztec view of creation and the need to cherish the here and now and its brief delights so quickly snatched away by the relentless gods. Aztec sculpture is also most worthy of note. Not only are we impressed by the monumental figures, clearly the product of a virile civilization, but also by the smaller objects fashioned in stone. Whether of man or beast, these exhibit a talent that is both graceful and intimate. The great conqueror had now enjoyed his last triumph and was soon to be struck down by a premature death. While his armies ranged far and wide over Mexico, the Spaniards had already crossed the Atlantic to Hispaniola. At this moment, therefore, we are writing of an empire, on the one hand seemingly standing at the apex of power, but whose death knell was shortly to sound. For regardless of the success or failure of Cortez's expedition some 17 years later, the triumph of Spanish arms within the next generation was inevitable. Before, therefore, embarking on the next reign and discussing the doings of the ill-fated Moctezuma II, it may be appropriate to consider the state of the Aztec nation at this supreme moment, just before the death of Ahuitzot. Evidence has already been quoted to suggest that the empire was nearing a point of no return. In proportion to the remoteness of the new land conquered, the complaints grew ever louder that the game was not worth the candle. The ruler himself was forced to adopt new palliatives to reward his soldiers for the privations imposed. Even his own colleagues played truant when they could. It is worth noting that the next sovereign, Moctezuma, did not extend the bounds of empire in terms of distance from the capital. Some insistence has already been placed on the rather loose-knit nature of the whole structure. The tendency to dominate without imposing direct control persisted under Ahuitzot. In spite of one moment of aberration, he himself had been a firm upholder of the monarchic principle, even restoring dynasties in such places such as Chalco, whose direct government had been formerly imposed. Thus, at the time of the conquest, virtually the whole empire was ruled by subordinates, acknowledging as their supreme head the rulers of the Triple Alliance. This system was not entirely dissimilar to that employed by the British in India, in those parts that were not brought under direct control. Its efficacy was, however, circumscribed by the lack of any system of communications such as the British had provided. It must moreover be appreciated that while Ocelot made conquests at great distances from the capital, huge tracts of intermediate territory remain unsubdued. This is true not only of the official independent states such as Tlaxcala, to be discussed in the succeeding chapter, but of countless hills and valleys lying off the line of march of the Aztec armies, and where they scarcely penetrated. The empire was more a network of strong points than a composite territory. The latest acquisitions on the Guatemalan border were only joined to the rest by a series of bastions rather than by a continuous band of territory. The empire was also somewhat ill-balanced. To the northwest, Querétaro, well within Tarascan territory, is today only a 2-hour drive from Mexico City, and Toluca, almost a frontier city, is little more than 1 hour distant. On the other hand, the limits of empire in the opposite direction would take nearer 20 hours to reach on the modern road. What Ocelot left behind was a vast but almost skeletal edifice. It remained for his successor to consolidate many intermediate areas. For this reason, it is well nigh impossible to trace any true boundary line of Aztec-dominated territory at the time of his death. Map 5 marks his main conquests, but does not attempt this task. It would not be altogether accurate to draw a line round these and denominate the whole area thus defined as Aztec-dominated. Like the sun in its daily course, an empire cannot maintain a fixed position. It must either rise or descend. It is possible that the Aztec sun was not far from the zenith when the bearded gods appeared in the east. The Tarascans in the northwest impose an effective limit to Aztec expansion. To the south and southeast, the Aztecs faced peoples more pliant and less united. As long as they were prepared to march up and down dale, there was no real obstacle to their conquering as far as their legs could carry them, in spite of the difficulties already mentioned. Fantastic though the thought may seem at first, it is unlikely but not impossible that the Aztec and Inca armies might have met one day, had their empires been granted a further span of life. For if the Spaniards had not intervened in 1519, the Aztecs would have conquered Guatemala and probably the Yucatan Peninsula at the eastern extremity of Mexico. This possibility certainly exists, but in furthering such aims, the empire would have added more to its problems than to its wealth. The temptations to conquer might have been pressing, since the traders already penetrated these areas and military expansion tended to follow closely in the wake of the merchants. What had already been achieved represented a prodigious feat of arms. One is, however, compelled to doubt whether the rather rudimentary imperial organization was capable of absorbing yet more territory, with the limited means of transport at its disposal. Moctezuma II seemed to have understood this. Moreover, the economic advantages of further expansion could have hardly outweighed the drawbacks. The traders were already obtaining the rich stones of the Maya lands through trading posts on the Gulf Coast. Guatemala could only offer further supplies of wares already exacted from Soconusco. To break their heads against the Tarascan wall or kick against nomad pricks to the northeast would have produced no corresponding return. Reliance on the loyalty of lower rulers was a poor substitute for a system of direct or proconsular government, and led inevitably to continuous provincial revolts. The Aztec Empire was an imposing edifice, but its foundations were somewhat fragile. On the one hand, Aztec society, such as M. Jacques Sustel has rightly pointed out, was basically virile and had shown a capacity for internal change. But on the other one is left wondering whether, in ordering of empire, they could have demonstrated a like degree of flexibility. In assessing the Aztecs' place in history, their motivation as well as their organization required to be considered. The will to conquer has manifested itself in many forms in human history. However, the periods during which one people dominates others tend to be limited, and the rewards reaped by the conquerors often prove illusory. Where empires are concerned, the quest for power and glory is inevitably present, and was surely a leading factor in the Aztec expansionism. At the same time, the religious or doctrinal motive is less easily definable. The Mexica were the chosen people of Huitzilopochtli, and belief in their special deity was a cohesive force, spurring them to excel. But the god himself was an integral member of a large pantheon, and nearly all the other Mexica gods were shared by the people whom they conquered. They might add or impose the cult of Huitzilopochtli, but this scarcely amounted to religious proselytizing. Huitzilopochtli set the Mexica apart from other peoples, but the diffusion of his cult did not motivate their conquests. More apparent, however, in a system of domination ostensibly devoted to the gathering of tribute, is the economic urge. This may in part at least have arisen from sheer necessity. After the earlier conquests, in themselves partly a kind of takeover of the previous Tepanec Empire, the capital, Tenochtitlan, began to grow and was eventually to obtain proportions never before seen in a city of ancient Mexico, and hardly known at the time in the Old World. Moreover, this was only part of the story. The network of lakeside cities, including Texcoco, housed a vigorously expanding population, already too large to be fed from the limited resources of the Valley of Mexico. Without the livestock of the Old World, the pig, the cow, the sheep, and the goat, and with no pack animals, it was an uphill task to provide such an urban population with a diet sufficiently nourishing, and an enormous supplies of bulky foodstuffs such as maize and beans were required. The latter at least contained some protein, but only as a limited proportion of the whole, and therefore large amounts needed to be eaten to obtain an adequate diet. The tribute lists contain huge quantities of these products, although they are notable for the absence of meat, which could not be stored. But it is remarkable that in the reigns of both Ocelot and Moctezuma II, famines occurred, notwithstanding the tribute which poured into Tenochtitlan, perhaps for the first time in America, when urban development was generating its own problems. Conquest furthered its development, and in turn ever greater quantities of tribute were needed to feed more mouths in the lakeside cities. This was the first vicious circle to confront the Aztecs. But what is perhaps the most puzzling to our own way of thinking is that much of the economy, whether deriving from trade or tribute, seems to have been based not on securing of the necessities for the toiling masses, but ever-increasing supplies of gaudy feathers and precious gems, together with gold, jaguar skins, and other purely sumptuary items. If one were to take the accounts of the chroniclers at their face value, the impression would remain that all these tremendous exertions, involving such grueling marches and hard-fought battles, were undertaken simply to accumulate fabulous quantities of feathers and other baubles. It must, however, be appreciated that much of this apparently useless finery was in itself a necessity, and formed part of the panoply of war, and however expensive, was indispensable for honoring the gods on whom success depended. Moreover, the rewards lay largely in the hands of the ruler himself, who distributed the trophies more or less as he deemed fit. No doubt, the nobles were well endowed with land and riches of all kinds. The Spaniards marveled at their city homes. However, except among the rulers themselves, they did not encounter in Mexico that vast accumulation of individual wealth, the huge estates, and the throngs of menials that would have been at the disposal, for instance, of the senatorial nobility of Rome, or the grandees of Spain itself. One therefore seized the empire by the time of Ocelot, caught in a second vicious circle or triangle. The gods had to be appeased, and the sun had to be kept on his course by vast offerings, both in terms of human life and of ostentatious display. This necessitated endless wars of conquest. As a reward for such attentions to their requirements, Huitzilopochtli and the other gods provided yet more victories. Thus conquests ever more distant were effected, these in their turn providing for yet more lavish displays in honor of the gods. This process was a never-ending one. The gods offered victory. This in its turn provided food for the gods, who thus assuaged offered not peace but further conflict. As had been continually emphasized, there was little that was new either about the gods themselves or the ceremonies in their honor. Such a situation with conquests to provide for more ceremonies, and ceremonies to produce further conquests, may have been building up throughout the history of ancient Mexico, to reach a kind of crescendo just before the Spanish conquest. The Aztecs accordingly conquered both to serve their gods and to fill their stomachs. However, such aims are cherished by other nations, who never dominated their neighbors. One must needs seek an additional factor that oiled the wheels of conquest. In this respect, another impulse reveals its presence among the Mexica, the obsession with display as an object in itself. Time and time again one reads of the relentless efforts made to attract the enemy rulers and representatives to each new exhibition of wealth and might. One account after another tells of lavish gifts heaped upon free and subject sovereigns. With the Aztecs, the insistence on securing an audience for their actions, a common human weakness, seems to have become a mania. It has been rightly suggested that in the Aztec polity is to be found a basic tendency to what, among other peoples of the North American continent, is known as potlatch, that is to say, the intense concentration of effort on the temporary hoarding of wealth, with the simple aim of giving it away on one single occasion. With the Aztecs, this orientation was both internal and external. An example of what might be described as internal potlatch was to be found in the great banquets of the merchants. External forms of these same tendency were concentrated on the quote-unquote enemies, or peoples still unconquered, within or without the bounds of the empire. Thus, with some justice, the Aztec Empire might be best described as the potlatch state, a concept on the whole alien to European patterns of conduct and thought. We are told, for instance, that a whole year's tribute was given away at a Huitol's coronation. Thus riches were not sought in order to be stored away, or hoarded and handed on to one's heir, as in the Western world. What could not be displayed on the person of the owner was best dispersed to impress whatever outside guests could be mustered. A problem created by the conquest themselves was the reduction in supply of independent spectators for Aztec displays, as more and more peoples joined the ranks of the conquered. This was more true of the southern reaches of the empire than the north, where the unyielding Tarascans were to be found. The Aztec Empire, if it had been permitted to survive, would surely have faced two continuous dangers. Firstly, the external threat presented by these Tarascans, and secondly, the constant menace of internal revolts. As the number of subject peoples increased, and the distances from the capital grew ever greater, such dangers naturally augmented. Unless, like the Assyrians, in the latter phases of the empire, the Aztecs could have changed their methods and introduced a form of centralized rule, something for which one day may doubt their capacity. It is quite possible that, faced with the increasing resistance from within and without, the empire would have contracted, or even eventually succumbed. Much would have depended on personalities, on whether the second Moctezuma had been succeeded by the rulers of Great Merrick, or by other Tizocs. Aztec achievement in the decades before disaster ensued had been astonishing in scope and rapid in achievement. Such sudden destruction leaves room for every form of speculation. The empire was like a man struck down in his prime. One can only guess as to his future career. But whatever's one's uncertainties as to its future course, the Aztec eagle had already soared to spectacular heights. This concludes Chapter 6.